1886, Santa Clara County, B, which I means versus, I assume, Southern Pacific Railroad. Without any formal argument, the court declares a corporation a person with the same rights as human beings. They grant them the 14th Amendment right to equal protection that was supposed to protect recently emancipated black folks. Justices have since struck down hundreds of local, state, and federal laws enacted to protect people from corporate harm because these discriminate against corporations. And when you're done, just kind of hold your card out so that, no, you're done. Great.
Hale versus Hinkle, 1906. Corporations get Fourth Amendment search and seizure protections. Corporations use this right to demand that regulators get warrants before they can inspect businesses for violations of labor and environmental laws.
Dodge versus Ford Motor Company, 1919. The Michigan Supreme Court rules that a corporation exists to maximize profits for its shareholders regardless of the impacts on the planet, economy, or health and safety. This ruling mandates perpetual growth and practically guarantees human and environmental abuses.
Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Mann, 1922. Corporations get Fifth Amendment protections against the government taking their property without compensation. They use this right to argue that any law that infringes on their profit is a takings, and they can sue to recoup all the profits they were making and would have made if the law hadn't passed.
1933, Lewis K. Liggett Company versus Lee. The people of Florida passed a law that levied higher taxes on chain stores than local businesses. The Supreme Court overturned because it discriminated against chain stores and therefore violated corporate 14th Amendment rights to equal protection.
Buckley versus Vallejo, 1976. The Supreme Court rules that corporations have First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. Since corporations do not have mouths to speak with, the court rules that they speak by spending money in elections. This opened the door to a glut of corporate spending in the political process.
And First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, 1977. We had corporations use their First Amendment rights to overturn state restrictions on corporate spending on political referenda. This precedent is used with Buckley versus Vallejo to thwart attempts to remove corporate money from politics.
Pacific Gas and Electric Company versus Public Utilities Commission, 1986. Although PG&E has a monopoly on utilities in California, they refuse to allow an advocacy group to use extra space on their billing envelope to encourage energy conservation. The court sided with PG&E, upholding the corporation's right not to speak and protecting what they called the corporation's freedom of mind.
International Dairy Foods Association versus Amistoy, 1996. Supreme Court overturns a Vermont law requiring the labeling of all products containing bovine growth hormone, citing the corporation's right not to speak and extending it to statements of fact as well as statements of opinion.
Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, 2010. The Supreme Court reaffirms that a corporation is a person and states that any restrictions on corporate money in elections violates the corporation's First Amendment right to free speech. This ruling has
money, but more specifically, when you heard about each one of them, why would they want these rights? Say that again. Control.
Protection.
Protection against what?
We the people.
The people, right? Yeah, right. Exactly. So each one of these, almost all of these, are actually overturning a law that was passed by the public or the public's representatives and ruling it unconstitutional because it violated their rights. Right? Any other observations about this?
Freedom from impunity. They wanted no impunity from law.
To be able to do whatever. Yep.
No fines, no levy on their profits.
So why do you think they went through the legal process to do this?
Because we the people wouldn't let them.
Because we wouldn't let them otherwise, so they had to go through the legal process? Okay.
To sanitize their greed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. I like that. To institutionalize it, right? It legitimizes it. It's like we went through the legal process. This is, we did as we were supposed to. We followed the rules, and this is just what happened. Who are the ones who decided these? These are, what did we read off here? Supreme Court rulings, right? Except for this one, which is the Michigan Supreme Court. Right. So how many people were involved in those decisions?
Nine,
but yeah, 5, right? Because most of them are actually just majority decisions. 5 people get to interpret and decide that corporations, an artificial entity created by government, is actually going to be able to overturn the people's will and make our laws null and void and insert their own instead.
And that's go back to the 5%, remember?
Right, goes back to the 5%. Yes, I do think that it's not an accident that as people are driving themselves into the Constitution, we have a civil war. Women agitate for the right to vote and we win it, right? Oh, and then coincidentally, kind of around that same time, corporations start gaining in their rights. And it's like, let's have that 5%. Now it's even less, right? We can look at 1/2 of one tiny bit of a percent in terms of the people who have the most wealth. But to maintain that power and that control, legitimately, right? This is all legitimate. This is the best system in the whole wide world at work right here, right? This is democracy happening right here. Okay, so y'all stay there. There's one other thing that I want to add. Do folks know this history? Did you know this history? No? Or maybe you knew some of it, maybe more recently? Right.
Yeah, some of that history.
So there's an element of the legitimacy, and also this impacts culture, right? Can you think of any ways that these sorts of things impact our culture?
Planet, economy, health, safety.
Right, or like this one strikes me of like having to get a permit for workers, violations against health and safety of workers. So it's just sort of in the culture, the idea is that, basically you got to give a corporation a heads up if you're going to complain about what's going on in your workplace. What does that give them time to do? It used to be that all of the books were open to the public, and the idea of the culture was corporations have to serve the public good, and they are subservient. And that over time shifts and actually becomes that all of this is legitimized, and it's just in our culture that, of course you have to give money if you're going to regulate them and take from them. That's just part and parcel of the culture.
Our culture believes in the good of the free market.
Right. All of this stuff is propped up. Okay, so, but there's also another aspect of our history that I want to go through. So if you all could please stay standing, if you don't mind. And I need some new volunteers. And like I said, everyone at some point.
Get everybody lined up first, and then.
Okay, so, go ahead.
Bill of Rights, 1791. Outraged revolutionaries reject the Constitution as an elite property document and refuse to ratify it unless it contains basic political protections against the tyranny of the state. Their struggle is successful and they drive through 10 amendments to the Constitution that protect people's rights to freedom of speech, assembly, religion, and the press, as well as others.
Yay! We can cheer for that.
13th Amendment
1865, slavery is abolished in the United States and any place subject to its jurisdiction.
All right.
Civil Rights Act of 1866 extended the rights of emancipated African Americans by stating that any person born in the United States, regardless of race, is a U.S. citizen.
14th Amendment, 1868. Black males are now citizens. The law cannot discriminate against them in any way.
17th Amendment, 1913. The U.S. Senate is now elected by the people instead of appointed by state governments.
19th Amendment, 1920. Women finally get to vote after 75 years of struggle.
Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, 1954. The Supreme Court recognized that separate was not equal and ruled that public schools cannot be racially segregated.
The 24th Amendment in 1964 abolished poll taxes, which were used to keep blacks and others from voting in some states.
26th Amendment, 1971. Voting age changed from 21 to 18 years of age. Passed to recognize that if an 18-year-old could be drafted into military service, they should be allowed to vote.
Roe versus Wade, 1973. The Supreme Court rules that state statutes against abortion are vague and infringe on a woman's 9th and 14th Amendment rights to privacy. Abortion is legalized in the first trimester of pregnancy.
15th Amendment, 1870. Black males get the right to vote.
Social change in 1886. The year that the Supreme Court first gave corporations human rights, this is what the rest of the country said. Campaign for the 8-hour workday. Knights of Labor membership, 1 million with 60,000 black and even more women members. Farmers Alliance reaches 100,000 members. Populists draw up founding document to demand debtors' right and fight the railroad lobby. Eugene Debs builds the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen. Das Kapital by Karl Marx, published in English. Police brutalize labor activists in the Haymarket Massacre.
Right? That was not that last one, but all the other stuff was good.
Civil Rights Act in 1960 established federal inspection of local voter registration polls. 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin by federal and state governments. 1968 prohibits discrimination in sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, creed, and national origin.
All right, so the facilitator kind of messed up. Sorry about the order on that. Those two gentlemen are supposed to be right around here. Actually, 1886, the long card, that's the same time as Margaret's, right? 1886. So my bad there, but you know. So how many folks knew? Well, go ahead, Lucy. What were you saying?
Well, I've got a question about the 14th Amendment.
Okay.
Because my memory is that it read former slaves rather than black people, or I mean,
it says persons.
Former
it just says
persons. Former persons who were slaves, or something like that.
No.
Persons.
So
persons, but you said blacks instead of persons. And
Well,
that's where
many
it got
of these are sort of paraphrased to be what they meant and what happened.
But the word person was in there, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, so but actually they're called the Civil War Amendments. There's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that were actually all separate, which is part of the political struggle. But the 14th Amendment that you described is very clear. No person shall be denied equal protection of the law. So the fight over who gets to be a person at that time becomes incredibly important. And isn't it interesting that corporate personhood begins whenever it's clear that the law cannot actually infringe upon a formal person. So this notion of personhood is really becomes a political, legal, cultural struggle as a result of the victory that the Civil War represents.
Regardless of previous condition of servitude?
Regardless.
No, that is the 15th Amendment about the right to vote.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are other observations about this? How many folks knew this story?
Most of it.
Most of it? Yeah, okay, so we do learn that. Why do you think these movements sought to codify these amendments, like to actually drive their demands into the Constitution? Why do you think that happened?
Because corporations were killing us.
Say, well, yeah, potentially, yes. I mean, but also to go back to that legal issue, right? It's not just, it's one thing to exercise your rights, but if they're not actually acknowledged by the law, then the law can actually come in, you know, the system, whether it's government or the police or what different aspects of the system can come in and actually stop you from exercising those rights,
well,
right? Yes?
The only way to keep the courts from overturning a law is to make it part of the Constitution so that they can't overturn it as a law.
Right, so didn't we read Civil Rights Act here? No, don't reread it, but that was yours, right? Civil Rights Act? Right. So what happened last year, or earlier this year, the Civil Rights Act?
The Supreme Court.
Oh, yes, the Supreme Court reinterpreted and got rid of, not all of it, but some part of it, right? Because it's not codified in the Constitution, so they have the power to do that. And they do not have the power to do that on these other issues. And coincidentally, a lot of these movements initially just worked on laws that were not actual constitutional amendments. Sometimes they were working in tandem. And ultimately, though, all of them recognized we have to actually put this in the Constitution. Yes?
Could I, because we're talking about this, let's just make a note that there was a struggle and a political sort of compromise got made during this time. Lucy, you want to read the 24th Amendment again?
Abolished poll taxes, which were used to keep blacks and others from voting in some states.
And what year?
1964.
Matthew, what year?
1964.
So the 24th Amendment succeeded at the constitutional level. So a poll tax cannot be instituted. The court cannot reinterpret any law to revisit it. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was a huge victory in and of itself, because that movement did not succeed in driving itself into the Constitution, now this outrageous current court has the audacity to completely gut it because it was, quote, merely legislation, right? So again, for us, this notion of coming to terms with the fact that any movement that actually deserves to be called a real movement that wins or a victorious movement ultimately needs to find its way into the Constitution. Otherwise, we have not actually fully won. That's the reason that we really want to underscore this part.
Okay, so but what about, so we have both groups standing up here. So what, you all are standing in front, but what does it mean when, yes, we have all these rights, but then corporations have these rights back here as well? What does that look like? What does it mean? They're both standing up at the same time, right? Because all of this is the law. So what are the implications of the fact that the pink cards, hold those up, are also the law? That we have all these rights, but corporations have rights too. There's a conflict in the system?
They've got the power to create those decisions, influence those decisions,
individuals that have been given expanded liberties,
Mm-hmm.
whereas these are rulings that have interpreted those liberties in favor of corporations.
Right. So maybe they got expanded, but then they get shrunk down a little bit. Certainly with Citizens United, for example, it's like all of these rights to vote and access to the electoral process, but then, we're just going to trump it with our giant foot to actually buy the candidates who get to then, and then you can decide amongst yourselves, which of the two that we bought already you want to choose to be your leaders. Yeah.
Maybe it's telling us that if you want to improve the condition of the citizens, it requires an amendment.
Okay,
If
good.
you want to improve the conditions of the corporations, just buy a court.
Right, or maybe an amendment to actually put the court back in its place, right? So what about this amendment? Here, why don't you pop up and read it?
The We the People Amendment, which would be the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Artificial entities do not have constitutional rights. Money is not free speech, and therefore campaign spending can be regulated at the local, state, or federal level. Passed in... Working on it, y'all.
Okay, so what would this amendment do?
Give the power back to the people.
It would overturn potentially all of this, right? All of you can go sit back down. Not all of you, not the blue people.
The greedy people.
All right.
That's a pretty powerful constitutional amendment.
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, so stay with me, stay with me.
Tom's got the answer to my question. Passed when? 2016. I like how he thinks.
Okay, so, but you all stay there. And Lucy, I saw you had your hand up. Yes, ma'am.
Well, my comment sort of fits with what Bob Wilson said. Somewhere I've read that at least a horribly lot of the Supreme Court judges, before they became appointed to the Supreme Court, were actually corporate lawyers, and there's a certain point of view.
Yes, absolutely.
And they're
right.
By the court.
So we have one more set. I need, and you can repeat come up if you were already up there and you're down. Okay, so let's read this set of history as well. We're going to start over here.
I moved so I could hear.
That is great.
Okay, Act 10, 1639. This Virginia colony statute grants the privilege of armament to all white men, including indentured servants, but excludes black men.
Negro women not exempted from Tax Act the 7th, 1668. Virginia colony law declares free English and free Negro women will be equally taxed, but Negro women will still be without rights.
This one's so hard, I don't want to read it. Act for Preventing Negro Insurrection, Act 10, 1680. Blacks are banned from carrying weapons of any kind, and if they presume to physically resist any Christian, they are punished with 30 lashes on his bare back, well laid on. Blacks could also legally be murdered if they are found lurking in obscure places avoiding labor.
The slave and servant codes of 1680 through 1705 established the term slave as equivalent to Negro, while servant now refers only to non-blacks or white persons. Slaves can be accidentally killed by their masters without penalty, and are slaves for life along with all their children. In contrast, servants are granted new protections and privileges, including the right to take their master to court, the right to marry another European immigrant, and the guarantee of a severance pay and a plot of land when freed from service. Black-white marriage is banned, and interracial sex is frowned.
The Naturalization Act, 1790. Immigrants are allowed to become citizens, but only if white. Without citizenship, non-whites cannot vote, own property, file lawsuits, or testify in court.
U.S. Constitution,
1789. The writers of the Constitution were very interested in protecting their property and increasing their wealth. They wrote a founding document that protected property of the people and removed the government from the will of the mob. Without using the words slave or slavery, they made slavery legal and institutionalized it.
The Bill of Rights, 1791. The first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution were adopted to protect we the people from excesses of government. At this time, we the people meant only white males who owned property and were over 21 years old. Only 5 to 8% of the people in the United States counted as people and got the protections of the Constitution.
Indian Removal Act, 1830. Indigenous peoples are forced from their homelands east of the Mississippi River. Over 10 years, approximately 100,000 native children and adults marched thousands of miles west into unknown desert territory. 15,000 people died along the way.
Cherokee Nation versus State of Georgia, 1831. A Cherokee delegation sues the state of Georgia for stripping their people of land and rights. But the court rules they are a, quote, domestic dependent, unquote, nation, unable to claim status in court, validating Cherokee removal and state seizure of their land.
The People versus Hall, 1854. Non-whites are barred from testifying in court. California Supreme Court reverses murder conviction of a white man, dismissing the testimony of a key Chinese witness, stating that no black or mulatto person or Indian shall be allowed to give evidence in favor of or against a white man.
Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. A slave sues his former owner for freedom in a state where slavery is banned. The U.S. Supreme Court rules that Negroes are not U.S. citizens under any circumstances and have no rights which any white man is bound to respect. Free blacks are taxed like whites, but receive none of the rights and protections of citizenship.
The Homestead Act, 1862. 50 million acres of formerly indigenous land in the West seized by U.S. invasion in violation of treaties is distributed by the government at low cost to white settlers only. An additional 100 million acres of land are given for free to railroad developers.
Minor versus Happersett, 1874. Women argued that the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause ensured their right to vote. The Supreme Court rejected their claims, stating that the 14th Amendment was only applied to black males.
Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It bans the immigration of both skilled and unskilled Chinese laborers. This act is expanded in 1924 to restrict other Asian immigrants and ban Chinese white marriages in California.
The Dawes Land Allotment Act of 1887 forbids and criminalizes land ownership by indigenous people communally and encourages and incentivizes legally Native people to sell their land to whites. It breaks up collectively owned Native lands and redistributes millions of acres as property to white settlers.
Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. The Supreme Court ruled that state laws enforcing segregation by race are constitutional if separate accommodations are equal. Black males effectively lost equal protection rights and access to the privileges of the white world.
Johnson-Reed Act 1924 creates immigration quota system based on national origin, favoring Nordics from Northern and Western Europe over the inferior races of Asia and Southern and Eastern Europe.
National Housing Act, 1934. Following the Great Depression, a federal housing authority is created
effectively amounts to labor rights for white men only.
Social Security Act of 1935. This act provides old age insurance for the mostly white workforce of certain industries, excluding domestic and agricultural workers who are mostly
Japanese American internment, 1942, forces all Japanese American and Japanese residents living on the west coast of the U.S. into unsanitary fenced concentration camps called war relocation camps. Over 111,000 people are interned, 2% of them American citizens.
GI Bill 1944. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act offers education and housing subsidies to returning war veterans, but severe social discrimination, poverty, and lack of education prevents black veterans from receiving these benefits, while white veterans benefit disproportionately.
War on drugs, 1971. President Richard Nixon declares a war on drugs, which disproportionately, violently targets economically impoverished communities of color for the next 40 years, leading to mass incarceration for drug-related offenses. White populations are relatively unaffected.
Three strikes laws, 1994. 26 states passed mandatory minimum sentencing laws that require jail time for first and second offenses and life in prison for crimes as petty as stealing a pair of gym socks, shoplifting a pair of baby shoes, and stealing a slice of pizza. In California, blacks make up only 7% of the population, but 45% of those convicted of a third strike.
National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, 2002. NSEER, or is it Sears with the title? It mandates that all nationals over the age of 15 from 25 specific countries, all of the Arab or Muslim parts of North Korea, report to the government, fingerprint, and photograph questions as part of the special registration program. People were given no individual notice of these requirements, but if they fail to register, they would be deported or charged with criminal offenses.
Arizona Senate Bill 1070, and this was in 2010. Police are required to ask individuals to present their citizenship or immigration documents if they have undefined reasonable suspicion that the person stopped may be in Arizona illegally, justifying racial profiling and harassment.
Post 9/11 disappearances. Immediately following the attacks in New York City, thousands of Arab, Muslim, and South Asian men living in U.S. cities are snatched from their homes, places of work, and off sidewalks by federal agents without warrants or charges. Shackled hand and foot, detained and prevented by the Federal Bureau of Prisons from contacting family, press, or attorneys. Many were held for months in abusive conditions. Not one of these thousands has ever been publicly charged with terrorism.
Alabama House Bill 56, 2011, year before last. In addition to police, school administrators at the high school, middle school, and elementary levels are required to demand citizenship or immigration documents for any child who they reasonably suspect is living in Alabama illegally. Children are racially singled out in classrooms in front of their peers and handed papers from their teachers demanding to see immigration or citizenship documents.
Stop and frisk, 2011. In 2011, New York City's discriminatory stop and frisk program continues to escalate, with over 680,000 public police stops made on the street, and 84% of those stops being of blacks or Latinos. Justified as a gun control measure, less than 0.2% of stops turn up guns, while 88% of stops result in no charges at all. Most major cities have similar policies, especially those with large black and brown populations.
Hey, so I'm asking you, is there any way that we can get copies of all of these cards?
These materials are available on our website, as are the instructions for how to do this exercise. But let's just, I know that it was actually really both hard to read those cards and to hear them, right?
Right.
So let's just take a moment, breathe in the room and the community that we have here, okay? And then breathe out all that we read. We're not gonna, let's like put it to the side over here, and then we're gonna talk about it. Okay, so take it out of yourself over to here for a moment. Okay, so how many of you knew about that history? Just raise your hand.
Some of them.
Okay. How many of you, if you're up for it, really didn't know any of that? Anybody? Okay, so we get little bits and pieces. Is there anybody who knew every single one of those policies? Okay. How does it make you feel to
Ashamed.
Mad as hell.
mad, ashamed, any other words?
Sick.
Sick, angry, sad, discouraged, disgusted,
Embarrassed.
embarrassed,
Fired up.
fired up, okay? Deceived. Yeah. Okay, so how is whiteness, similar to corporate rights, a construct of the law? Did that become clear?
Yeah.
That it's just a creation of the law and then it's reinforced over and over again. And did anyone notice kind of, you know, it's hard to see with the people in behind and but the kind of, if you were able to look at the trend and when you look at the materials online, you can kind of see how as people stood up to demand their rights be recognized, there were laws that came in to either nullify or minimize those. What's a good example of that we actually probably all know?
The voter rights. What is it?
Jim Crow?
ID. Well,
Oh, yes, the voter ID. Yeah, so that was a thread through it, right? Of who would actually get to be all the voter suppression.
But something that I see here coming back is the redistricting.
Restricting?
Redistricting.
Redistricting, yes. Oh, there's a lot more that we could have read, right? There's other things too. So, yes.
You left off a huge number of people who are gay who have been denied the right to marry in this state.
Yes.
By a vote of this state.
Yeah, we were focusing on race, but absolutely, we did throw the one in there about women trying to use the 14th Amendment to get their right to vote, and the court saying no. But yes, there are other threads of oppression for sure that are codified in the law. Yeah.
I want to get back to the racial thing for a minute, and just, I don't know how many people in here have read the new Jim Crow, but it is absolutely indispensable to start showing how this thread of what you're talking about, attempts are made to gain rights, and then there's always this counter-cyclical attempt to prevent that, and if that's not prevented and rights are gained or expanded, then the attempts are made to whittle away those rights by another form that isn't quite as discriminatory or blatant. And it's ongoing and it hasn't been ever since this country started.
Constant struggle. Yes, Tom.
Well, just trying to get through that. You came talking about corporations. Underneath this is about the Jim Crow, is the fact that corporations are like prison.
Yep.
They're actively politicking in terms of those laws and not changing those laws.
Right. Yeah. So there's actually policies that the prison industry, they go to elected officials and say, yeah, we'll build a prison for you, but you have to ensure 95% occupancy. So stop and frisk and things like that are developed because it's actually an agreement that our government is made with private companies to make sure that there are people in jail. Yeah, I saw him back here, yeah.
Well, something interesting that I saw in the thread that kind of started over here in the first few days was that separation of servants versus slaves and how there's that distinction made. They gave a lot of servants a little bit of power, and it carried through, and it's like over in the labor organizing line. I think that created a willingness for those that had that power of separation that, well, we weren't going to really fight for everybody's right to organize. We were going to settle, well, you know, at least us white folks have the power to organize, you know, immigrant workers don't. So not only is it our legal system with corporations fighting to use those laws to oppress us, we have, you know, made, I guess, considerations or compromises to oppress each other as well instead of demanding those full rights.
Sure, right. The connection, thank you so much for pointing that out. The connection of the law and the culture, and then the culture gets reinforced by folks, even if it is not the law. And then when we organize ourselves, we help perpetuate sometimes, you know, there's a history of drawing those distinctions and leaving people out. Okay, we're going to go 1, 2, 3.
You also, you know, the power of the media. You know, how do you get certain people to feel that, you know, they're special, this is right, and all the propaganda and scapegoats, and who owns the media?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, so that's again the culture that helps prop all of this up. 2.
I agree with Trish in that I noticed that here it's like the white person is given just a little crumb, and so as it progressed, it almost seems like we're going backwards.
So extend that a little bit more to old people versus young people, where union contracts are being negotiated so people who have their jobs keep their rights. People coming in as young people get less wages, less benefits, and that's happening in government as well as places where you have union contracts. So so we got old versus young, black versus white.
So it's here, 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 and here. So 1, let me do this, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're going to need to start to wrap it up, and we're not done, but this part is keeping that. So this
right, yeah.
one,
Yeah, some of these measures like stop and frisk can seem reasonable safety precautions if you don't know this context. So we have education working.
right. Well, and they probably seem reasonable to white folks, right? And did anyone see the Daily Show thing about stop and frisk that they did?
Yeah.
If you didn't see it, go back and look at it. It's brilliant. It's a bunch of, they have a bunch of people of color, black and brown folks talking about stop and frisk. Almost all of them have been stopped. Folks who, you know, regular people, right? And then white folks, and they're like, there's no problem here. It's like, obviously, because it's not what's happening. You are not dealing with this, so you don't notice that it's happening.
One person, one white person said, I
Right.
got stopped, I got interrogated in an airport.
Yes. Right. And that's, so imagine if that was you every day in your neighborhood, what happens to you at TSA? By the TSA. 2 was a period.
I think it was about domestic services or Cherokees, somebody that come from another world and reason that happened. The owner of this land is just beyond.
Yep. It is, the genocide is intense.
Not going to be moral teaching to the Syrians.
Couldn't hear that.
3, let's see, right?
Just a gentle reminder to ask people to stand up when they speak.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, who's 4?
I'm divided.
Yes, you were.
Okay, so anyway, to me it was sort of a cautionary thing to remind myself to be diligent about other people's rights, because it's not cool anymore to have, you know, be against women's rights or black rights or Native Americans. We accept that. But now this Muslim Arab thing, I find that our culture is not very diligent about protecting their rights. Like we've got this spirit thing from 9/11. We don't seem to be that concerned about this disappearance of all these Muslim men, right? And I have a son-in-law that just puts on Facebook, I hate Muslims. You know, it's shocking, but it's there. And so just to be, you know, remember to stand up really much.
Yes, thank you. Well, and perhaps the fact that we have this whole history makes it possible for stuff like that to happen, right? Instead of just passing it on down to the next wave of folks. Is there something, anybody? Yes, and then we'll go to the history. Yeah.
Just to follow up on what you said, Kate, the whole idea of religion being used as to drive a wedge between people and sort of make the other out there different. But the other thought I had, I don't know who said this in one sentence, it's very, very powerful. If I believe a corporation is a person, the day I see one executed.
Say it again. Say it again.
He said, I believe the corporation is a person when Texas executes one. Are you in Texas? All right, Rita, and then George, and then
Well, I just want to reinforce what Barbara said. Those of us who have difficulty with hearing may be in the minority, but we are a growing majority.
okay, so maybe, how about this? If you can't hear what the person is saying, let's just make a hand signal to remind them to raise their voice up. Okay? George.
So I'm not going to stand. I have no doubt that my voice fills the room. And what struck me about the whole exercises at Bill that's really powerful is it underscores the concept that I'm not that comfortable talking about that often, which is white supremacy. We talk about racism, but we're in a culture and a world where it's a white supremacist culture. And those of us who grew up in the South, we hear white supremacy, we think it's Klan. I'm not talking about the Klan. I'm talking about a culture where you could look through all that and say, what is the key goal? Just as the pink cards were like, at all costs, let's make sure corporations are okay. The key goal that we just saw in those yellow cards was, at all costs, let's make sure that white people are the top of the pecking order, no matter what. And that creates white supremacy, which is invisible and not even tangible if you have white skin, but is absolutely every experience you have. You don't have white skin. From the moment you step out, a person, I was having a conversation with someone about race recently, and she said, I don't want to say anything that makes you uncomfortable. I was like, girl, only people worry about being uncomfortable are white people. If you're not white, comfort doesn't exist unless you're in your house with the door locked, with people you know, and you have a warning system that you know what they do. If you've got comfort, please.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
I live in Virginia now. I'm originally from the Midwest, but the thing, I think in Virginia when it came down to integrating schools, they just shut them down. The public school systems literally shut down. And I think as a society, that the price that we pay Black men most specifically, when you have a bunch of people that are not, that can get no gainful employment and that are, hanging around, problems ensue. And it's just such a sadness that, and it's, we clearly have big problems here, all across the board.
Margaret?
I lived a lot of my life in Arizona. I lived with the native tribe, the Hopis, for a year while my husband taught at their high school. Their children in the years of the early 1900s were taken from them, forced to go to schools in Phoenix that did not allow them to speak their own language, to perform their own rituals and rites. They are so easily ignored and not thought of that I find that even more out here on the East Coast, because I knew I was going to school with Native people in Arizona. I knew when I was on their land, and they don't call it a reservation, they call it home. It's their land from thousands of years before any white person came here. So I think we have a blindness that goes beyond just racism. It's a horrible history to learn. But I would just ask that you remember, I mean, I just hear it so much out here on the East Coast, a complete obliviousness to Native people that still live on their own land out there and are treated terribly. Their land is polluted and they have no recourse. It's unbelievable. So.
There definitely, I think oftentimes the story is that there are no Native people left, they're all gone. And actually, it's not just out west, right? There are people who still live in North Carolina who were here before white folks came, and in every part of the country. Yes, there were a lot of people who were part of the genocide, but they're not all gone.
Yeah. I had a friend who called me racist once because, okay, hang on, I'll start over again. I was raised in this church. I had a friend from this church who, a little while ago, called me racist because she told me I was ignoring my white privilege. And that hurt me very deeply because we were both raised in this church that teaches like principles of just loving everyone and being accepting of everybody and not being just being a good person. And while that hurt me a lot, it did make me think about, yeah, we have white privilege, and that's not something I think about because I think that I don't treat anybody differently, but everybody else will treat me differently because I'm white. And people aren't aware of that, and people don't think of that, and that's something we as white people should probably think about because if we see it, we can change it because we do have more power, but we need to be more aware of that.
Thank you for adding that. So I just have one last question and then we're going to take a break. But what about the phrase, and it comes up, restoring democracy? We talk about move to amend, or this effort, or this amendment is about restoring democracy. So what is the kind of code that we may not even realize we're using when we say that about who we're talking to and who we're talking for, right? Because a lot of us said, we maybe didn't know this history. Well, if you're a Native person, the Homestead Act, you know that history. There's no, you know that. There's all sorts of elements. If you're an Arab American, you know about what happened after 9/11. You can't be alive and not know. You know about stop and frisk if you're a black or brown person. So part of that white privilege is being able to just go through the world and not necessarily need to know this. And so when we talk about reclaiming democracy or restoring democracy or our founding fathers, those are all, and there may be, some audiences where that is the correct and good way to kind of make the entree, right? Who are those audiences? White folks, right? But there are all these other folks who there's no reason why our amendment is going to help everyone, right? And if we're building a democracy movement, we're about democracy for everyone. So we need to be real intentional about the story that we're telling and not leave this part out because maybe it's uncomfortable for white folks to hear. Or maybe those Tea Party people that we were talking about that we want to reach out to, they probably aren't super down with telling that story, right? But if we leave it out, we are telling an incomplete narrative of the situation that we're in and what has happened to get us here. And we're not really serious about democracy for everybody. And just to be very clear, the move to amend is. And so we ought to together figure out how we're going to talk about undoing all of this, not just corporate power, not just the fact that all of a sudden white folks, our vote maybe doesn't count so much now either, but the fact that there's a long legacy of that for the rest of this country. Yes, Ken.
You were talking about democracy.
Stand up.
I was. You were talking about democracy, and when we're out on the street getting people to sign petitions, or when we're trying to get some space like this, people will sometimes say, but that's political. That's right. How do you answer that?
Well, I think that's a longer conversation, potentially, and that's something that I would encourage you to ask your peers about. But, yes, it is political. It's political that we don't have power, but it's also cultural and economic, and it's our lives. Do you feel like we have that authority? No? Well, that's what we're working on. That's what we're working on. Justice. I love that word. Thank you. Yes.
So I think that when you hear that back, in our own head, what we should recognize is that we're talking to somebody who has bought the idea that we should depoliticize our country. You know who wants to depoliticize the country? The wonders, right? Because they recognize that political power, actually, you know what, I was a political theorist before I went to law school. Politics is the art and the science of how you make and implement decisions around allocating goods and services in a society. Right? And so, in one sense, Kenneth, of course, and this is the thing, actually everything is political. What you choose to eat is a political decision. Where you choose to eat is a political decision. What clothes we are wearing is a political decision. So there's one level that I wouldn't respond that way. Now, if you are trying to get a venue in space and they say move your men, you can't come here because it's political, the answer there is, oh no ma'am, we are actually an educational process. We have a 501c3 to educate people, and so there is a different conversation to have depending upon what you're provoking. And I'm happy to talk to you offline or anybody else about if you need some help getting a library or a community center or so forth, and you're being told you can't come because